In times like these, the stories of our lives can be very helpful as we try to negotiate these rather confusing and troubling times. As many of you know, I was adopted at a very early age. And over the course of my lifetime, that adoption has led to some fairly dark and confusing times in my life and raised a number of questions about identity, where I came from, what life was about, where life was going, what this all meant. I found many of those feelings cropping up in these days of confusion and crises. And as they have, I found myself going back to my story and remembering how I dealt with those in the past. And what I've begun to recognize is that there were some things I did, some strategies I practiced, some things I learned that were really helpful in dealing with these dark and confusing feelings. And there were other things I did that simply made life worse. And so, as these feelings have cropped up these days, I've been able to implement some of those strategies and thoughts. And lo and behold, they have again become sources of comfort, of strength, and of hope. It was very similar to those folks that found themselves in exile in Babylon. One of their first questions in this time when their lives were turned totally upside down was, have we ever been in a mess like this before? And their answer comes fairly quickly. Ah, yes. Back in the days of Moses, when we were in bondage to Pharaoh in Egypt, it was a lot like this. One of the great crises for those living in Babylon was that without a temple, they were not able to offer sacrifice. And sacrifice was how they maintained a good working relationship with God. But as they remembered that story of Moses, they remembered especially in that journey in the wilderness that God made a new covenant with them. A covenant based on the law, the Torah. And so there in exile, God's people totally retooled their understanding of their faith life. They went from a people of sacrifice to a people of keeping the law. And that sustained them, not only in those days, but in the years and the centuries to follow. It became a new way of understanding who they were and what it meant to live together as God's people. One of the other stories that is remembered in this time of exile raises the question that if God could send a deliverer like Moses to the people of Israel in Egypt, could not God send a deliverer to the people of Israel now in Babylon? And so becomes the expectation and the anticipation of a new deliverer, a Messiah. And that Messiah comes in the form of King Cyrus of Persia, who manages to defeat the Babylonians and send the Jews home. Not only was it a source of hope and comfort in the time of exile, but this idea of Messiah becomes a hope in the midst of future times of crisis and oppression under the Greeks and later the Romans. And it becomes the centerpiece for the early Christians as they begin to try to make sense out of this Jesus of Nazareth. God's story, my story, all are ways to begin to make sense out of what we are going through these days. But so too are the stories of those who gather around us, those that I like to call the great cloud of witnesses, the company of the saints. And a couple of those saints that have become very important to me in these days. The first is Raymond, now of blessed memory. When Raymond and I were alone in conversation, he would often share of the hardships that he endured in the early days of his life and in his young adulthood, and oftentimes in tears, for these were incredibly difficult times, trying to live on $1 a week, going through the Great Depression. They were times not only of hardship, but of great learning. And Raymond was proud to share those learnings with me. And one of the greatest of his learnings was that in the midst of the hardship, in the midst of seeming scarcity of life, he learned about generosity and how his own generosity in those times had a strange way of sustaining him, even when he was not sure when his next meal would come from. And so it has been very easy in these days. Then what comes to that line on the bill from either the people that deliver the groceries or the takeouts, to be very generous in that tip line. Thank you, Raymond. The other story that has become very important is the story of my mom. You see, my mom and I were reunited after 62 years last year. And it has been as I have begun to learn her life story, and particularly her life of faith, that I found in that story and in her accompaniment with me during these days a great source of strength and comfort, and sometimes even a smack upside the head when I start to doubt and lose faith. Thank you, Mom. You see, stories are important to us in these days, for they give us shape. They give us strength. They give us hope. They can bring us comfort. Our own stories, God's stories, and the stories of those gathered around us. To death, they will sustain us in these times until our joy is restored and life is new. We will learn much from these days, and they will become part of our stories. They will help us in the days ahead when we face other trials and crises. But they will be even more important for those who follow us as we tell our stories and as they learn about these days. They too may find hope and comfort in what we have learned and how we have walked. Let us pray. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, our shelter from the stormy blast, and our eternal home. Under the shadow of your throne, your saints have dwelt secure. Sufficient is your arm alone, and our defense is sure. 1,000 ages in your sight are like an evening gone, short as the watch that ends the night before the rising sun. O God, our help in ages past, our hope for years to come, still be our guard while troubles last, and our eternal home. Amen.